Hello, historians. Welcome back. Today we will be discussing the civil rights era. Today we'll kind of talk about 1962 to about 1963, 1964. A lot is happening in the early 1960s. Last week we talked a little bit about as civil rights really gets going in the 1950s, Brown versus Board of Education that starts to desegregate schools and other places. We Emmett Till's murder, which really is the spark to the civil rights era, as basically people are seeing it in a different light. They're seeing the wrongs that are happening in the South, and by the time we get to the 1960s, the protests really get ramped up. We talked a little bit about like the Freedom Riders, trying to make sure that the constitutional rights are enforced in the South with interstate bus travel. We saw the sit-ins at Woolworths, but things are really going to ramp up in the early 1960s. And you can see the picture here. You've got Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Marching, and we'll see some of that as we discuss the 1960s. 1962, Air Force veteran James Meredith enrolls at Ole Miss. All right, University of Mississippi, Ole Miss. Just sounds like the Deep South. And this is groundbreaking. Now, here's a veteran, right? This is a Air Force veteran, a man that served his country, and he is going to be the first African American to attend classes at the University of Mississippi. He had to be accompanied to classes by U.S. Marshals. There were riots that broke out. Over 200 protesters were arrested. They brought in thousands of soldiers to National Guard to break it up. And during the riots, there were 2 deaths. There's not a 30 for 30, but there is a segment there's some type of program on ESPN I saw once about James Meredith kind of breaking the segregation, and then the sports and athletic teams also slowly but surely will also be desegregating later on, more in the 1970s than the 60s. So here's James Meredith today. So we're slowly seeing desegregation into the schools, and it's not easy. On a national level, 1962, Wilt Chamberlain, African-American basketball player in the NBA, scored 100 points in one game. He's one of the most dominant players in the history of the game. And so once again, we saw it last week when we talked about some 1950s artists like Chuck Berry, and some athletes that start breaking the color barrier. Basketball teams start adding more African Americans in the 50s and 60s. And of course, Wilt Chamberlain, very dominant. Bill Russell will come into play for the Celtics, who was also a dominant African American basketball player in the 60s. One of the biggest events in the 1960s was the Birmingham campaign. The goal of this campaign was to bring attention to the efforts of African Americans fighting segregation, whether it was in a public restroom, whether it was getting jobs, whatever it was, they wanted it desegregated, and there was a big fight in Alabama. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference was leading the charge in this. The civil rights leaders were there. Martin Luther King Jr. was there and encouraging people on. They called it Operation C. Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth was one of the leaders down in Birmingham, down in Alabama, and basically said, as goes Birmingham, so does the nation. If we can change Birmingham and we can change Alabama, we can change the rest of the country. And so this was a major fight. You're talking about one of the most segregated, probably one of the most racist places in 1963 in the country. Now, the protesters were using civil disobedience that we talked about last week. They were protesting and they were not using violence. However, the protest led to violence by the people putting it down. So thousands of people were arrested. And some of these iconic images, and we'll see some video of it, where You have the police dogs, these German shepherds, attacking the marchers. Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested, and he was put in the Birmingham jail. Sorry, while he wrote a letter that was published in many newspapers across the country, mostly northern newspapers. But it was published, and it talked about his fight against social injustice. And we talked about Bull Connors last week. He was in charge of Alabama's public safety. And so he was the one saying, hey, we need to put these marches down. We need to put these protests down. And he had the police attack the protesters with clubs, fire hoses, and police dogs. At one point, children were also out protesting because most of their parents were in prison, were in jail, being arrested for protesting. And same thing, they had the dogs and the fire hoses go right at the kids. Imagine watching on television as people or children are being blasted with fire hoses and rolling down the street because the power of the water is so fierce. You can see some famous photographs here. Now, part of the goal of this is to get the publicity. If you want your message to spread across the country, you need photographers there. You need the TV stations there. Certainly, the invention of television a decade earlier, or it coming into almost every American home by the 1950s, was very important in spreading the civil rights message. Another iconic photograph here. In September of that year, the schools were desegregated, and Governor George Wallace sent in the National Guard to make sure that African Americans could not desegregate the schools. And JFK, Kennedy basically orders them to stand down and says, you need to listen to me, the president, not the governor. We'll hear more about George Wallace later. He gave the famous speech, Segregation Today. What was it? Segregation yesterday, segregation today, and segregation forever. Something like that. I'll have the quote later on. Right around that same time, the Birmingham Baptist Church blew up. There was a bombing there, and there was an explosion. The church was mostly empty except for some young girls practicing in the choir, and 4 of them were killed. The Ku Klux Klan claimed responsibility for this. You can see some of the destruction here. And of course, the local police weren't working real hard to figure out who did it or arrest anybody. After Birmingham, Martin Luther King Jr. is looked at as a national hero. Right? People are looking at him as a person that is standing up for his rights, standing up for other people's rights. Not everybody's probably looking at him like this, but a larger majority of people, no matter what their race, are looking at him as a hero. And of course, today we would hold him to very high regards. The Kennedy administration begins to work on the Civil Rights Act. And JFK, we'll see it in a little bit, but JFK was preparing a speech in case George Wallace, the governor of Alabama, did not back down and did not allow the schools to be desegregated. And at the last minute, George Wallace backs down. Kids are able to enter the schools. And Kennedy decides, I'm going to give the speech anyway. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But what it did for sure is it showed the nation, it showed the country and the world what was going on with segregation in the South. Medgar Evers, he helped with some of the boycotts up in at the Woolsworth department stores, the lunch counters that we saw. He was an NAACP field secretary. He had been a World War II soldier and participated in the Normandy invasion. He had traveled throughout Mississippi and encouraged poor African Americans to register to vote, which was very dangerous to do. He also recruited for the civil rights cause. And he also was instrumental in getting witnesses and evidence for the Emmett Till murder case down in Money, Mississippi, that brought a lot of national attention to the plight of African Americans in the South. So he was a big name. He was right up there with Martin Luther King Jr. and others at this time. And then in 1963, he is gunned down and murdered in his driveway. And of course, same thing. Nobody works too hard to find the evidence and anything like that, but they do arrest a suspect. There were 2 hung juries, all white juries in the 60s, and basically nobody went to jail for his murder. In 1994, 30 years later, the case was brought back up with new evidence, and they did find the suspect guilty, and he did go to prison. He was 73 at the time. If you'd like to see a good movie about it, it's called Ghosts of Mississippi. And that tells the tale of Medgar Evans getting murdered, and his Whoopi Goldberg is his widow. Alec Baldwin is the prosecuting attorney, and James Wood is the murderer. Another famous civil rights leader, but maybe kind of a different kind of civil rights leader of the 1960s, is Malcolm X. American Muslim minister and human rights activist. He joins the Nation of Islam, changes his name to Malcolm X when he does that. The Nation of Islam is a group, it's a political group. So it has ties to the religion of Islam, but it's something totally separate from that. And their goal was to spread the Islamic religion across the U.S. They also advocated for separation. So a little bit different than what Martin Luther King and others are preaching in the NAACP that want everybody to come together. They're advocating for separation. They're talking about black pride, and where Martin Luther King Jr. said nonviolence, civil disobedience is what we'll use. Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam said we will use violence if necessary. So he certainly kind of scared the American public with his rhetoric. He ends up taking a trip to Saudi Arabia, to Mecca, in 1964. And when he comes back, he's a changed man. He leaves the Nation of Islam, starts his own group, and starts preaching that racism, not white people, were to blame. So he basically kind of changes over, doesn't talk about violence anymore, and kind of starts acting maybe more like Martin Luther King Jr. And then he is assassinated, but he is assassinated by the Nation of Islam, by that political group, really a radical political group. And his autobiography came out at that same time, and his teachings in that autobiography would end up leading to the Black Power movement. And I'll have a video on Malcolm X later. 1963, another major event. So we're looking at really the same time period as the march in Birmingham and everything going on. Your fire hoses, your attack dogs. Now there's a march on Washington, and this is the March for Jobs and Freedom. Basically to say African Americans are having trouble getting an equal job in the workforce as white people. And so this march draws over 200,000 people, black and white and other races, all together. And you can see it. Here it is. Here's the Washington Monument. Behind us then, if this is the Washington Monument, you have the Lincoln Memorial behind us. And look at all the people there, big crowd. You can see the button, August 28th, 1963. This is before Kennedy gives his famous civil rights speech. Many famous public speakers, artists, clergymen, all sorts of civil rights leaders, entertainers, politicians showed up and gave speeches there. You had Bob Dylan and Joan Baez and other artists show up and play music. I'll have some links to some of this in a little bit. They performed at the March on Washington. However, Bob Dylan, Hibbing, Minnesota. However, probably the most famous part of the day, and now when we look back on it, it's history, is Martin Luther King Jr. gives his I Have a Dream speech that we'll also take a look at. And so he was the last one to speak, and he gave by far the most powerful address there, something that is still remembered today. I think every kid, when you talk about Martin Luther King Jr., in their head pops the I Have a Dream speech. And then lastly, JFK gives his civil rights speech that he wasn't going to give. He was only going to give it if Alabama refused to desegregate their schools. They back down, and JFK decides, I'm going to do it anyway. And he goes on national TV and he gives this speech, which was controversial because it hurts him with some Southern voters. It hurts him with legislators and congressmen that are going to be voting on bills that he wants to pass. They might vote no just to spite him. But he basically gives this famous speech and says that, and I'll have a link to it later, but he says basically, hey, every kid deserves a chance to nurture their talents and become something great. And what we're doing in our country is not allowing a certain percentage of our Americans that right. And so this is going to be the basis of the 1964 Civil Rights Act that turns what he says into a law. Is he alive in 1964? No, he ends up being assassinated about a month after this. However, they would continue on with the civil rights fight. And so that's where we'll stop. And we will pick up here later and continue on. I will have some video links below this for you to view and watch some video on what is going on with some of these